everybody, it's time once again for a 2021-2022 season preview. And today we're going to be talking about a team that's been very successful in the regular season, but has not been able to win in the playoffs. They've had a lot of roster turnover this offseason. They've made quite a few different moves, and we'll see what they're going to look like this year. We'll see they're finally able to get that playoff success or not, but we are talking about the Edmonton Oilers. Before we begin, I just ask you to please hit that thumbs up and subscribe. It helps the channel a ton and is greatly appreciated. But let's get into our preview here. And before we look forward, we have to look back. The Oilers last season went 35-19-2 on the year, 72 points, and a second-place finish in the North Division. Only Canadian team better last year was the Toronto Maple Leafs. They had a very strong offense behind the likes of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, scoring 3.27 goals per game. They were pretty solid defensively as well. Mike Smith had a really strong year in goal, and they only gave up 2.75 goals against per game. So while that's certainly not top of the league numbers, it's a very solid goals against number there for the Oilers. So in the regular season, they were pretty good offensively and pretty good defensively. They were a pretty well-rounded team up there in the North Division. Their power play was absolutely unbelievable. And you would expect that with guys like McDavid and Draisaitl and Tyson Barrie quarterbacking it. But 27.6% on the power play last season. That is an incredibly good number, pushing up towards 30%. Obviously, the best power play in the league. They were the best power play in the league by 2% over the next closest competitor, which I believe was Carolina at 25.6%. So just incredibly good on the man advantage last year. And their penalty kill was also very, very solid, 82.5% on the penalty kill. Their special teams were very, very strong. So it was another very good regular season for the Oilers last year. They were one of the best teams in the North. They had a good offense. They had a very solid defense. Their special teams were fantastic. The regular season was great for the Oilers, but the playoffs were not, as they got swept out by the Winnipeg Jets in round one. And playoff success has been the problem the last couple of years for Edmonton. They've been good in the regular season, but they haven't been able to put it together in the playoffs. And this year is going to be a huge season for them, trying to finally put it together in the playoffs and at least win a round. And they've made quite a few moves this offseason to try and take that next step and try and find that playoff success. As you can see, a lot of roster turnover here with Edmonton, both addition-wise and subtraction-wise. On the subtraction side of things, Adam Larsson was taken by Seattle in the expansion draft and then signed a 4-year deal with the Kraken. So that's a pretty significant loss off of the back end for Edmonton. Their best defensive defenseman in Adam Larsson is no longer there. They also traded away Ethan Bear and Caleb Jones. So there's a couple of younger guys that are no longer there on the back end. Forward James Neal was bought out. Dmitry Kulikov left in free agency. He was a deadline pickup last year. Depth forwards, Jujhar Khaira, Dominic Cahoon, Gaetan Haas, Alex Chiasson, Tyler Ennis, and Joakim Nygard, all gone as well for the Oilers. Some of them have found other NHL jobs. Some of them have gone to Europe. Chiasson's still a free agent. So a lot of depth out of that forward group has left as well. That's 6 guys, 6 depth forwards for this team that are no longer there. So obviously not significant pieces leaving the lineup, but just depth-wise, all of those guys combined is definitely a bit of a hit. And they've lost, obviously, some important pieces on the back end as well, especially with Larsson and Bear no longer there. As far as the additions go, Their big offseason addition was the signing of Zach Hyman, who's coming in from Toronto. And you've got to expect him to be playing a top 6 role on the wing with this team. And he is a massive addition to that forward group, trying to get Draisaitl and McDavid some help offensively. They also traded for Duncan Keith. Duncan Keith coming in from Chicago. Now, he's obviously dropped off significantly over the past couple of seasons, but I still think he can be a really good veteran guy in the right role, as long as they don't try and play him 22 minutes a night. In the right role, Duncan Keith can still be effective, and I think he can help this team. I just hope that they don't try and put too much on his plate, as he has definitely declined over the past few years. They also signed defenseman Cody Ceci, who had a pretty strong year with the Pittsburgh Penguins last year. If you watch this channel, you know I've never been a Cody Ceci fan, but he actually had a pretty solid year in Pittsburgh last year. It's going to be interesting to see how he fits in with this Oilers group. They traded for Warren Foegele, a kind of third-line grinder type forward coming in from Carolina. They traded Ethan Bear for him, so he's going to come in and try and provide some third-line support for this team. They also brought in Derek Ryan, who spent the last few years in Calgary, so another depth forward addition there. And they signed Brendan Perlini, who is another depth forward. Obviously, they needed to bring in some depth forwards with all the guys that they lost. And Perlini will maybe be an extra forward, maybe be a fourth-line guy for this team. He hasn't really found it yet at the NHL level, but he's still fairly young and does have, some upside potential. And with a team that needs all the depth that they can get up front, that's not a bad signing, in my opinion. We'll see how he fits into the lineup, and whether he's an everyday player, whether he's an extra forward, that will be determined in training camp and the preseason. So obviously they've made some pretty big moves this offseason, trying to shake this roster up a little bit, trying to get some new blood in there and see if those are the changes needed to have this team go somewhere in the playoffs finally. So now it's time to look at my projected roster for Edmonton. Again, this is just based on what we know right now. This is what I think their roster will look like probably to start the season. And obviously, they've got some depth guys that could maybe compete for a roster spot. But up front, obviously, you have the staples like McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent-Hopkins, Hyman coming in, Zach Kassian, Puljujarvi. Kailer Yamamoto just re-signed. Foegele going to play a significant role on that third line, I believe. Derek Ryan also going to play a pretty big role for this team, given the depth that they've lost. Devin Shore's been a fourth liner for them. Kyle Turris is an interesting one. He had a horrible year last year. We'll see if they stick with him and he makes the team or not. He really needs to play significantly better than he did last season, or you could see him end up getting waived. Josh Archibald, good depth forward for them for the past couple of years. And then Brendan Perlini they brought in. We'll see, where he fits in. But they don't have a ton of depth up front, so I do think all these guys are likely going to make the team, although there is one or two that could potentially change. Defensively, Darnell Nurse, Tyson Barrie, those are your two best D-men. Then you've brought in Duncan Keith, you've brought in Cody Ceci. You got to imagine that they're going to play fairly significant roles. Evan Bouchard, it's time for him to really step up, especially with Ethan Bear no longer there. They need Bouchard to really step up into a full-time, not even top 6, but maybe top 4 role for this team. Chris Russell, the old veteran, he'll play a depth role on the back end, and then Slater Cuckoo. Either him or Russell will be the number 6 and 7. I don't know, which one ends up playing and which ones is the number 7, but those are your last two guys. In goal, you've got Mike Smith returning as the starter. He had a very strong year last year. We'll see if he can repeat that. And Mikko Koskinen is still there to back him up. There was some talks this offseason about Koskinen possibly being moved, but that has not happened yet. So at least as of right now, he's looking like your backup goaltender. Then we get to the depth category, and There's not a ton of depth here for the Edmonton Oilers, but there are some guys to watch. Colton Sceviour is in training camp on a PTO. Sceviour had been playing with the Pittsburgh Penguins, but he kind of fell out of favor and got his spot taken. Honestly, with the lack of forward depth that the Oilers have, I would not be surprised if Sceviour does get a contract and is able to make this team. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how the preseason goes, but he could definitely be some fourth-line depth that this team could use. Ryan McLeod is a young guy that played some NHL games last year. I think he has the potential to steal the spot of a Kyle Turris. If Kyle Turris is going to continue the way that he did last season, I think that it's very likely he gets waived. And then Ryan McLeod is a guy that could step into that role and play there instead of Turris. Tyler Benson is back. He's another, younger player that could see some bottom six wing time with this team. And then Cooper Marody is another one that could, be a call-up if needed. On the back end, you've got William Lagesson and Philip Broberg. Those are kind of, Lagesson I think is like 25 now. He's a tweener on that line between AHL and NHL. If you need a defensive call-up, Lagesson will definitely be on the list. And then Broberg is their young guy, 20 years old now. I think he's going to start the year in the AHL because they're going to want him playing rather than being a depth guy at the NHL level. They'd rather have him playing top pair minutes in the AHL and continuing to develop and grow his game. But if they need a call-up, at some point in the year, if they're down a couple defensemen, Broberg definitely can come up and play NHL games. And then they have Alex Stalock, who I think is going to be their third goaltender. They also have Stuart Skinner, but similar to where Broberg is, like Skinner is 22, I think they're going to want him starting in the AHL and playing regular games in the AHL and continuing to develop and grow rather than have him be a third goalie or anything like that. So I think they've brought in Stalock, who they picked up on waivers last season. I think he's likely to be the third goaltender for this team. And then Skinner is going to be your regular starter down in the AHL. But if anything were to happen to Smith or Koskinen, I think Stalock would probably step in as the backup. But that is my projected roster for the Edmonton Oilers this year. Obviously, there's a lot that's the same. McDavid, Draisaitl, Nuge, Cassian, Puljujarvi, Yamamoto, Nurse, Barry on the back end, Smith and Koskinen in goal, but there's also a lot that has changed. You've got Hyman coming in, you've got Fogle coming in, you've got Keith and Ceci coming in on the back end, so there's been some significant moves and certainly some turnover for this team this past offseason, but there's still a lot of the core pieces remaining in place. So that is my season preview for this year for the Edmonton Oilers, and obviously the big goal for the Oilers this year is going to be to do something in the playoffs. They've been a playoff team, they've had solid regular seasons, but they haven't been able to win in the playoffs. I think the logical next step for this team is to win in the playoffs, win at least one round, if not try and win two, and take that next step to having some playoff success. And we'll see if they're able to do it. We'll see if the moves this offseason were the correct ones and we're able to push them forward into that next step. That's just something that's going to be figured out over the course of the season. But I'm certainly expecting them to be a playoff team, especially in the Pacific Division. That division is going to be fairly weak this year, so they should easily be in the playoffs. It's not really about that anymore for the Oilers. That should be a given. What it's about now is finding a way to win in the playoffs. So with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. All those links are down in the description. If you'd like to further support the channel, our merch store, membership, and donation links are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.